Hello, my name's Charlie. You may remember me from summers past at Camp Harlem helping out with the Teva team alongside Sydney Gluck. During these times of quarantine and no school, people are often looking for meaningful ways in which to engage with their surroundings. And what better way to do that than to go outside? I would like to introduce you to a few plant specimens that are some of the first to show their blossoms and their green foliage in the springtime. Let's take a walk. If you're in a more wooded area, you may see little yellow blossoms, such as these, on lower shrubs. This is the spice bush. It's known to grow down in lower places. It'll sometimes grow up on hills, but oftentimes it likes to grow near water. And for scale, you can see my hand next to the blossom. They're quite small. The spice bush, when it puts out its foliage, has wonderfully aromatic leaves that can actually be made into a tea. You can also snap a twig off if the spice bush is willing to allow it, and smell it. And it has a smell, it's hard to describe. It's sweet and minty, almost. If you see these yellow blossoms, try snapping a twig off and giving it a smell. And if it has a distinct smell, it's probably a spice bush. They're growing all throughout this valley that I'm looking at here. And they're quite common in most of eastern North America. They can be found in places like Schmungaland, for example. Those of you who live in Pennsylvania will probably recognize this understory shrub. This is the mountain laurel. It's known for its wonderful white blossoms, which will be showing up in June. Currently, if we look very closely, we can see the beginnings of the blossoms. That's these little sprigs here coming out of the center of the leaves. And the leaves are quite tough. They are smooth and shiny and they feel almost like leather. I'm going to crouch down under the mountain laurel here to show you what its bark looks like. Its bark is kind of stringy, and they grow in these twisty, tangly kind of shapes. They also make for a nice little fort to hang out under, with your little critter animal friends. Hey, Mr. Chipmunk, what do you want from me? Now, the mountain laurel is actually, you could consider it an evergreen because it keeps its green foliage through the winter. And during that time, food is very scarce for herbivores such as the white-tailed deer. And some people find it surprising that the green foliage of the mountain laurel doesn't get eaten. It turns out that there are chemical compounds in the mountain laurel that are carcinogenous. They can cause cancer. So just like smoking, mountain laurel is bad for your health. That is, if you were to ingest it. This here is a wonderful native wildflower called a bluebell. Bluebells, I believe, are native to Virginia. So for those of you that are up in Pennsylvania and the New York parts, you may see less of these. They're commonly found in more wooded areas closer to water. This here is a rhododendron. And much like the mountain laurel, its leaves are tough and shiny and they remain green throughout the winter. I have hung my hat in the center of this rhododendron to show you just how large this one has gotten. This one was actually planted here many years ago, and it's usually not found in this area where I am currently. These are the leaves of the rhododendron. Tough and shiny, quite large, almost as long as my hand. Now, the rhododendron is not necessarily found often in Northern Virginia, where I am currently. However, in the more mountainous regions of the Mid-Atlantic, such as the Poconos, it can be found closer to moving bodies of water, such as the stream that we do the stream hike on. If you have done the stream hike, you will recall making your way under a lower canopy of darker foliage. Those are rhododendrons as well. And if you're lucky and you do the stream hike at the right time of year, you will see the rhododendrons in bloom, which have this wonderful white and pink blossom. Kind of makes me feel like I'm in the jungle when I'm walking underneath them. Whoa. Now, as we look down into this valley here, we can see that there's a lot of bright green leafy foliage. And there's a body of water moving down through this valley. We're going to go down there and take a closer look at it. This, my friends, is skunk cabbage. Yes, it is aptly named because if you break off a leaf of skunk cabbage and take a whiff, it has quite a distinct scent, odoriferous, if you will. Yes, some people liken it to the smell that a skunk will make. I think it smells closer to like really strong onions. And at one time, I believe the native peoples of Eastern North America used this as a food source. Although I think they had to like cook it down a lot to kind of get rid of that spicy scent. As you can see, the skunk cabbage leaves are quite big, and they will continue to grow even bigger. It's been quite a mild winter here in Virginia, so it seems that the plants and the animals have gotten kind of a head start on spring. I can't say I've seen the skunk cabbage this big, this early in the past. The blossom of the skunk cabbage appears in the winter, and it has a very specific, interesting ability to actually metabolize its own body heat. That is a privilege that's usually only reserved for animals. However, there are mechanisms within the blossom of the skunk cabbage that allow it to create its own heat, which prevents it from, being damaged during a frost or during snow. It also means that any of the pollinators, such as flies, who are active in the winter, will be able to access the flower. If you are out and about in the woods, you may see smaller trees that are still holding on to their leaves. They have kind of like a sort of like a sandy beige look, and they'll often tremble when there's the slightest breeze. These are beech trees. Unlike most deciduous trees in eastern North America, beech trees will actually hold on to their dead leaves throughout the winter, meaning that the tree holds onto them until springtime. And in the spring, of course, it'll send forth its new leaves, and at that time, the old leaves will drop off. There are theories that the beech tree will hold on to its leaves through the winter so that its leaves can continue to degrade in the sunlight and in the winter weather. Then, when it comes time for them to drop onto the ground, they are that much more easily made into mulch for the tree. You see, the forest is really good at making its own mulch. It does it every year during the autumn. And then, of course, in the spring, it has a second little boost of leaf mulch on the forest floor from the beech. If you are perchance roaming out near a vacant field, you may see a sort of lower shrub like these. As you can see, they are all around me, and they are distinguished by that sort of much lighter, softer green than perhaps the dark green of this onion grass. This is called the autumn olive. So, as it turns out, the autumn olive is what people call an invasive plant, meaning that it did not originate in eastern North America. I don't know where it came from, but when it did come here, it found that it could quickly take over in spaces that were not utilized. So, for example, maybe there's like an old field that's not being used for farming anymore. The autumn olive might be one of the first shrubs to show up there. If we take a close look at its leaves, we see that its leaves are kind of almost silvery. They have a kind of like a white, it almost looks like dust. Let me take a close look there. And the underside of the leaves are actually much lighter than the top side. This will become more and more apparent as the leaves become bigger. They will also eventually produce bright red berries. The birds seem to love the berries that this shrub produces. And when the bird eats the berry, it also ingests the seed. It'll then fly off, poop the seed out, and there will be growing next year a new autumn olive plant. Now, when it comes to invasive plants, a lot of people are like, invasive plants! And I can understand if they are disrupting the balance of the ecosystem that was here before the plant arrived. This is, of course, a force of nature, and it's not so easy to hold back forces of nature. So in that way, you know, it's still a plant. It feeds the birds. I think it's all right. These flowers are, of course, called daffodils. And it's very interesting to see where daffodils end up. They're often planted in gardens. Oftentimes, the bulbs that they produce at the base of their foliage are dug up by animals or wash away in a stream, and they will end up in kind of random places, like in this old field with a boat. Now, if you see something growing on a tree that looks like this, the tree it's growing on is a maple tree. These are, of course, the beginnings of the famous whirligigs that in a few months will be streaming off of the trees. This shrub here is called forsythia. And my mom always used to call it my birthday bush because in a few days it's going to be my birthday, and usually it blossoms around that time. You can see that the blossoms are quite small. This tree here is called a Bradford pear. Now, it is in the same family as the pears that we eat, only it doesn't produce fruit that is nearly as big. I don't even know if it produces fruit at all. If you are out and about and you see white blossoms like this, and you smell something very funky, kind of like old feet, you can be sure there's a Bradford pear around. It is one of the first things that blossoms in the spring. Here's another example of a Bradford pear, a little more flower than foliage. And again, this plant has very stinky blossoms. They kind of smell like what I imagine Aaron Selko's socks smell like after the 3-on-3 basketball tournament. Well, I hope you have enjoyed this little excursion of ours. I know I have. Nature is one of the things that I am most passionate about. I feel so much better when I step outdoors. And perhaps if you have some extra time on your hands, you can find a similar experience. I would encourage anyone to find that for themselves, whether it be nature or anything else. Find what makes you thrive. Find what makes you tick and dive into it. Especially, if you're sitting around with some time on your hands. You could use this video as a sort of prompt for going on your own nature walks. And I hope that you have found it informative.